we'll go to our next panelist, Renjeng Lui, who is presenting a paper on explaining it away on the explaining it away on the enigma of time in Husserl's phenomenology and time consciousness. Renjeng is his research focuses on the phenomenology of time and finitude and subjectivity and plurality. He just defended his PhD thesis, congratulations, on a Heideggerian ontology of temporal differentiation. This is at McGill University, and he will be taking up a postdoctoral research fellowship position at Tsinghua University. So with that, please welcome Renjeng. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, sorry.
Great. Thanks. So thank you for having me for this conference. And likewise, just like for Miranda, so this paper is 2 years old. And a lot of things have changed. This is actually the birthplace of my dissertation, though later I switched to a more Heideggerian context. But nevertheless, we're going to see a lot of things that I actually also touched upon in the dissertation. So I'm going to start sharing the slides here. Is it visible? Great, thank you. So my title is Explaining It Away on the Enigma of Time in Husserl's Phenomenology of Time Consciousness. And specifically, I'm focusing on Husserliana X, which is the inner time consciousness lectures. So because after doing this research, I have heard opinions about, there are some limits to my research presented in this paper. Specifically, I did not take into consideration the development of Husserl's thinking on time in the Bernau and in the C manuscripts. And actually, Nick de Warren was on my defense committee, and he raised these concerns. So I guess today, my purpose is just to present the work as is and to hear what the Husserlian experts think about this. I know that Tony, Miranda, and Bob are all experts in this area, so I'm willing to hear what you guys think about this investigation. And so this is the outline of my presentation today. I'm first going to explain a bit what the enigma of time in the title means for me and for my investigation. Then I'm going to take up Husserl's beloved melody example to explain how the enigma of time plays itself out in the example. And then I'm going to focus on the notion of absolute time consciousness, which I think is a point of dispute when we're trying to interpret Husserliana X. And lastly, I'm going to raise a question about whether there is a lingering sense of constitutive foundationalism when we're trying to make sense of Husserliana X and trying to think of it as a finished work. Because my view on this issue is that it's an unfinished work. It's an open work site that still needs some modification there. So that's the basic tension that we're going to see in the presentation today. So first point about the enigma of time. I think the enigma of time can be best expressed in a tension between two sides here. So I'm putting it on the slide. This we can see in, for example, Husserl's lectures on the passive synthesis. Thus, we can also see, for example, in Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. So this is a recurring issue concerning the phenomenology of time. And the tension is between these two sides. The first fact or phenomenon, as we could call it, the first phenomenon is the actual incompleteness of manifestation, meaning that the givenness of a concrete being, like a table, a person, a social political movement, and so on. So the givenness of a concrete being takes time. So, for example, you get to know me, the person, only in the fullness of time. We get to know the results of a social political movement only in the fullness of time, and so on. And so it comes in installments and is never complete. never fully determinate. We never get to know all the details of a leaf or a flower and so on. But on the other hand, there is this apparent completeness of presence. And that means at each moment of manifestation, this being is grasped as a unity. And that means it pretends to be complete. So for example, if I'm looking at my laptop, I'm only looking at the front face of it, but I perceive it as a laptop, not just as the front face of a laptop. That's for our natural attitude. So in our perception of things, we already intimate that there is a tension going on here. So how could it be the case that we actually never get a full view of the thing, but at the same time we think or we perceive it as a unified thing? So that's the tension here, and that I call the enigma of time. So facing this enigma of time, we have different attitudes. We could have different orientations. One orientation is, of course, to try to solve the paradox. And to solve here means to provide a foundation, which itself is not temporal, and to provide this atemporal foundation while compartmentalizing timeliness or temporality of the thing or of the events in one side of the distinction. For example, we make a distinction, we allocate timeliness or temporality to just one side of the distinction so as to keep this neat structure, which itself is not temporal. So that's one attitude towards the enigma of time. The other attitude, which I'm trying to propose here, is to live the paradox and to live it hermeneutically. And that means to let this enigma of time affect our theorizing activity. And the resulting theory is like the traces which are left on a riverbed when this enigma of time rushes through the riverbed like a flood. So this is a hermeneutics, I think, which follows the paradox, which tries to sort out what are at issue in it without attempting to solving it once and for all. So those are the two attitudes here. So the clue of my investigation here is first to see Husserliana X as a haunted work. So a work haunted by partly the enigma of time. So in my reading, Husserl was aware of the tension there, and he developed his theory in Husserliana X in response to that tension. To what extent he succeeded in solving the tension or solving the problem, we shall see very shortly. And following Husserl, there has been a lot of attempts to solve the problem when interpreting Husserliana X, especially in trying to make sense of Husserl's notion of absolute time consciousness. And I should note that this is only part of the story, of course, because we have later texts from Husserl, which we can explore perhaps in the discussion session. So let's just take up Husserl's melody example to explain what are really at issue in Husserliana X. So the question, the leading question I raise here is not exactly about how we should understand Husserl's interpretation of the melody example. That has been discussed amply, in my view. My question is rather why Husserl would need the example at all. So that's about Husserl's motivation, if I may put it like in this way. So melody for Husserl is a temporal object. He calls Zeitobjekt. So there is already a distinction between object and Gegenstand. So object could be internal, it could be external. So melody is a Zeitobjekt. And that means a melody cannot be grasped all at once. To grasp a melody, we need to follow it. We need to listen it through. So that's what is specific about a melody. And so when Husserl started accessing the phenomenon of a melody, of a Zeitobjekt, he started with a problematics and a conceptual framework, which I think is largely neo-Kantian. So something he inherited from Brentano's school and also exhibited in Alexios Meinung's work. So the neo-Kantian problematics focuses on the apprehension of objects. So of course, this word apprehension was borrowed from Kant's work, but the neo-Kantians gave it a kind of, in today's term, it would be a cognitive interpretation of Kant. And so the apprehension of objects means that there must be a synthesis of all the representations we receive about a certain object. For example, if we're hearing a melody, there must be a synthesis of all the tone components of that melody. We might first hear a C and then a D and an E and so on. Those components, those tones are heard and received separately. So the full determinacy of this manifold of representations is taken for granted. We do not doubt their full determinacy. But on the other hand, the unity of the object, for example, the unity of the melody, must be a product. And it's a product of an act of synthesis. So that's specific to the neo-Kantian framework. So manifold representations taken for granted, but their synthesis is a problem. And it must be interpreted as resulting from an act of synthesis. But there is a problem when it comes to a tight object, because if we take still the melody, it's impossible to have the totality of all the tone components all at once. When we hear the next tone, the previous tone has already sounded and it has fallen into the past. And according to this neo-Kantian framework, the past no longer is. So we do not have all the tones of a melody in front of us all at once. But we nevertheless sense or perceive the melody as a unity. We say we're hearing a melody. We do not say we're hearing, oh, this tone, that tone, and so on. So synthesis in the case of a tight object, in the case of a melody, becomes a problem. And that's just because we do not have all the components all at once in front of us simultaneously. So that's the challenge this melody example posed to the Brentano school and I think to Husserl at that period as well. And this is from Husserliana X. So Husserl wrote, and this is when commenting on Brentano's own theory of the original association. So it's also about perceiving a tight object. So Husserl says, in order to grasp a succession of representations, A and B, for example, so we can take those as tones in a melody, it is necessary that the representations be the absolutely simultaneous objects of a knowing that puts them in relation and that embraces them quite indivisibly in a single and indivisible act. So we see here that the unity of the time object is the product of an explicit act of synthesis. So that's where the neo-Kantian framework comes into play here. And Husserl continues, the intuition of an extent of time occurs in a now, in one time point. So this is the model where one kind of summarizes all the multiple components of a melody and kind of grasp the melody in an instant. The problem with that model, of course, is, as we have said, we do not have all the tone components in front of us. The previous tones have already sounded and they have sunk into the past. So we see the tension here in the melody example. So to summarize the problem here, the model of synthesis, the neo-Kantian model of synthesis, misses the temporal character of the tight object. Because according to this model, if we're able to summarize every component of a melody in one instant, then the melody could have been given all at once. If, for example, all the tones in the melody sound at the same time, according to this model, we would be able to grasp the entire melody as a unity. So that I think indicates a problem when we're trying to solve the problem with explaining a certain temporal phenomenon, when we're trying to base everything on a basis that is not temporal. And here it's a grasping act that happens in only one time point. So that's one way of attacking the enigma of time, and I don't think it's a successful way of attacking the enigma. And to continue, the challenge here that we could learn from this discussion is that how could we grasp something as a unity, even if it has not yet come to an end? So that's the issue here. Even if we're still hearing the melody, we could grasp the melody as an entirety. This is given the name the temporal synthesis, I think towards the end of Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. The temporal synthesis also plays out in Heidegger's discussion in Being Time about being towards death, because we're still living, we do not have the totality of our life, but in this being towards death, we grasp the entirety of life as a unity. So it's a recurring theme in some of the phenomenologists. Let's get back to Husserl. So in Husserl, this challenge of making sense of the enigma of time translated into a tension. The tension is between the fixedness and the fluidity of a certain moment. And by moment, I mean, for example, a tone in the melody. On the one hand, the tone must be fixed in the sense that when it sinks into the past, we still grasp it as identical, such that in grasping the entire melody, we could grasp it as a component of the entire melody. But on the other hand, when grasping this tone, we do not grasp it as static. Rather, we grasp it as fluid, meaning that it naturally or necessarily leads to the next tone. It sinks into the past, but at the same time, it brings up or lets the next tone well up. So that's fixedness and fluidity, and there's a tension between the two. Husserl once applied the schematic model to solve the issue of the fixedness and fluidity of the moment. So this is, I think, well known. So Husserl distinguished between the apprehension content and the act of apprehension. And here he thinks that the apprehension content, for example, the pitch, the timbre, the loudness of a certain tone, the content remains identical over time. Even if it sinks into the past, the content remains identical. And that means it's temporally neutral. This accounts for the fixedness of a certain moment. On the other hand, the act of apprehension happens in time, and it's kind of a process of temporalization. And so it temporalizes the otherwise neutral content. And that gives rise to the fluidity of that moment. So you see, this schematic model kind of compartmentalizes what is temporal and what is not temporal. And so it's like a neat structure which tries to contain the enigma of time, to contain whatever is affected by temporality, so as to remain neat, to remain structured on the larger scale. So that's about the schematic model, and we kind of also know that it led to a lot of problems. One of them I should mention here is the problem of the infinite regress. So starting here from the transcendent, and that means, for example, the melody. So the melody is constituted as a tight object. But according to the schematic model, the temporality or timeliness of the melody is constituted by an immanent act of apprehension. On the other hand, the act itself is temporal. It happens in time. So according to the model, there must be a further act which temporalizes this first level act of temporalization. And this leads to an infinite regress. Well, Husserl's solution, and I think that's part or largely the reason why the absolute time consciousness was introduced at the first time. I don't think later the absolute time consciousness still played the same role and in Husserl's theoretical artifice, but I think that's the birthplace of absolute time consciousness. So in response to the problem of the infinite regress. And so his solution is to say, well, first we have this transcendent object, the melody. There is an immanent act which temporalizes the melody, but then what temporalizes this first level immanent act is the absolute time consciousness. But what's peculiar about this absolute time consciousness is that it both temporalizes the immanent act at the first order and also self-temporalizes. So there is an introduction of a certain causa sui here. I wouldn't say it's a metaphysical position, but I'd say it's introduced with the same reason as the causa sui, because the causa sui was also introduced to avoid an infinite regress. So that's the absolute time consciousness here. And I've examined several attempts among contemporary Husserlians to interpret the absolute time consciousness, to make sense of it, and to make it part of Husserl's mature theory. So among these scholars, I think the most prevalent orientation is to assume that the absolute time consciousness names a pre-reflective experiencing as opposed to the experienced. So the experienced, it relates to the content, it's constituted, it's objectified, and so on. But experiencing, just as Husserl was distinguishing between Empfindnis and Empfindung, so it's Empfindnis and it's pre-reflective. For example, in Zahavi, we found that he says reflection is characterized by disclosing, not by producing its theme. So he means that we could always discover this layer of pre-reflective experiencing, but that's a mode of reflection. Reflection discovers this pre-reflective layer. It doesn't produce it. So if by reflection we're able to access this layer, it follows that this layer has always already been at work. So that's the reasoning there. So the infinite regress here is solved in the sense that it's only a potential infinite. We could always regress, we could always go back, but not necessarily, because we don't always carry out this reflection. Most of the time, we are just working pre-reflectively and perfectly. A more radical account in this direction is from James Mensch. So James Mensch kind of identified absolute time consciousness with a flow of impressions, or what he calls senseless sense data. These impressions or senseless sense data are themselves atemporal, and they become temporal. They are organized into a temporal object only in the process of temporalization. So upon examining these attempts to interpret the absolute time consciousness, the question I want to raise here is, first, what is absolute about absolute time consciousness? We know the word absolute has connotation. Back in German idealism, it served metaphysical purposes. So there is a lingering doubt that absolute here indicates a ground that is not further grounded, just like what we see in the notion of causa sui. So that's the first doubt here. I'm not quite sure about this. It's just an initial clue. And then as I get into the question, I think there is a lingering specter of foundationalism in the attempts to make sense of the absolute time consciousness that I just introduced. So the discussion that I carry out here, of course, is not about the accuracy of the interpretation, for example, Zahavi and Mensch gives. They could have given accurate interpretation of Husserl at a certain period. I do not contend that. The discussion is rather about whether this model of temporal object actually works, and instead of explaining time away. So that's getting back to the title. So are we explaining time, or are we explaining time away? So that's the question here. And here I am making a bit of assumptions, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not very confident in the identification here, for example, between constitution and transcendental conditioning, because I know there are various interpretations of the transcendental. But let me just assume that in the case of temporal objects, constitution means temporalization. So giving the object the characteristic of being temporal, of taking time to unfold itself. And I identify this constitution with transcendental conditioning. So upon this assumption, the problem of the infinite regress means that in order to avoid it, we need to assume a condition that is not further conditioned. And this condition in the Husserlian context is often identified with what is operative, fungierende. So that's something Merleau-Ponty also emphasized in Husserl. But this condition is also atemporal, because that's the foundation of starting from there is the act of temporalization, and thus we have the temporal object. But according to this model, time is explained as the product of the atemporal. And the atemporal specifically here is the absolute time consciousness, understood as that condition which is not further conditioned. And this leads us to Augustine's problematics, because Augustine, when trying to explain time, always had the eternity of God as the backdrop. So everything about time is created. The world is created, and they are all rooted in the eternal. And so according to this framework, when we get back to the basic tension I named at the beginning, we see that the incompleteness of manifestation of a certain object. So I never see the entire laptop, I only see the front face of it, for example. This incompleteness becomes accidental. So we could say in reality, this laptop already has all the details as that kind of atemporal content. It's just that me as a contingent human being has certain limits, and so I cannot access all those contents all at once. And that's just an accidental flaw on my side. That's nothing about the laptop itself. Right? So, but according to this framework, I think it's a bit hard to make sense of the temporality of temporalization itself. Because according to this model, we're assuming that from what is not temporal suddenly springs forth what is temporal. But this process of springing forth is itself a process which takes time, which happens in steps, let's say. And so it's hard to explain the temporality of this very process of temporalization. And that, I think, would lead to another infinite regress, if I'm correct in making my assumptions above. So to continue this, I found a passage in Being Nothingness is extremely interesting and extremely relevant, although Sartre was talking about more traditional accounts of time, not talking about Husserl. So Sartre, when talking about temporality, says that there's a certain tendency which assumes that there is a non-temporal, which is charged with providing the non-temporals with their temporality. So here it means the absolute time consciousness is charged with providing, for example, the tone components, the content, which are otherwise non-temporal, with a temporality, and thus makes the melody a time object. So temporality becomes a simple external and abstract relation between non-temporal substances. Such a reconstruction, made first in opposition to time, cannot later lead to the temporal. So the argument Sartre makes here is that you cannot produce the temporal from the atemporal. You cannot create temporality out of nothingness. So he continues, temporality can represent only an illusion resulting from human finitude. The chronological order is only the confused perception of an order which is logical and eternal. And that goes back to my explanation of how this is related to the problematics in Augustine. So everything is concerning human limits, not concerning the logical order or the ontological order of things. Klaus Held, in an article, also says that for Husserl in the period of Husserliana X, time is like a still form, a form that doesn't move. Time is a still form of happening, but does not happen itself. I found it hard to make sense of the entire claim that Held put up here. I found it hard to imagine how time happens itself. I mean, there could be conjectures, and if you have a clue, you're welcome to let me know. So that's that I think is the entirety of my presentation. Thank you. I'm gonna